Welcome to Solved, because if we don't tell you how to think, someone dumber on the internet will. My name is Jay, and our other resident solvers are Amanda, Deon, and Erin, who will offer a greeting now.
Hey there.
Hello.
How's it going?
Collectively, we produce the venerable, indispensable, not to mention award-winning podcast Best of the Left, where humans, that's us, curate progressive media on a chosen topic, creating episodes that are greater than the sum of their parts. On this show, we use those same curation skills to pull together stories and ideas that help us solve some of society's biggest problems. Today, we are tackling culture wars, and we're focusing on how they are, it's sort of like race. It's like total bullshit, effectively non-existent, but at the same time deeply, deeply true and important, and has major effects on society. I feel like culture wars are sort of similar in general, and so we're going to point out that they're bullshit and demonstrate and educate on how to pivot away from them to progressive ideas that really matter in a way that is not pure distraction and nonsense for the sake of, distracting people away from being robbed blind by the oligarchs. Am I missing anything, or is that pretty much everyone's interpretation of what we're doing today?
I thought that was a good summary.
Oh, good. I ad-libbed that because I forgot to write an intro this time. So we're starting with Trump's attack on Harvard marks a new phase in the culture war. Ross Barkin wrote this for New York Magazine. And this is sort of just a demonstration. Like, this is what culture war looks like, feels like, and it's total bullshit. So basically what it's getting at is free speech is one of the big culture wars going on right now. And so are the attacks on universities. Trump and company claim that they are one and the same, basically, but their stances on the two are actually diametrically opposed, because they don't really care about free speech, but they do care about hobbling universities for their own causes. So here's what the article has to say about it. Quote, Trump's attacks on speech will win the moment because he is president, but there's a longer war the Republicans can easily lose. They've proved they don't actually care about free speech, and they're violating their professed values so they can back a far-right Israeli regime, one that does not resonate with most Americans. A lot of voters are nominally pro-Israel, but most don't truly care either way, and they're looking on as Trump tries to jail and deport students who do little more than write op-eds and lead protests, end quote. So they're bullshit. It's fully evident that they're bullshit. And the side of the culture war that most people actually believe in, free speech, is the thing that they are jettisoning as easily as anything, and people are recognizing it. So, like, in terms of tackling the culture wars head on, there are major cracks to be exploited, but then there are further strategies to remind people what this is all about in reality.
Yeah. This, as far as the Venn diagram of what you were talking about with race and culture wars being fake and them being totally real, is a complete circle right now, because what's being said is they are protecting Jewish people. They are fighting anti-Semitism. Meanwhile, they are rounding people up off the streets for speaking. And this culture war backlash that I think we're starting to see is pretty indicative of a really popular manosphere, Joe Rogan kind of universe, the Theo Vaughn recently speaking out and saying, hey, I think maybe it might be bad what's happening in Gaza right now. And when someone who clearly doesn't give a shit about what's happening in the real world starts saying that on his podcast, I think that's a sign that maybe things are starting to turn. And that is an opportunity to pivot and get people to see that what they're saying about free speech and what they're saying about why they're doing the things they are do not match up at all. And it's a wonderful opportunity for a Democratic Party to jump in and say, hey, we actually are the free speech party, but there is an issue because I think a lot of the Democratic leadership kind of feels the same way that Trump does in certain regards in this issue. So there's an opportunity to push forward, and I think that's what this whole episode's going to be about, is like how we move forward in this moment, because the vast majority of people can see that killing a bunch of men, women, and children indiscriminately is bad, and saying it's bad shouldn't lead you to be jailed, pulled off the street, shipped to, I think I've seen yesterday people in Djibouti being handcuffed and led into some unknown prison. People are being taken off the streets and shipped outside the country to places that they're not from and have never been. That's not defending free speech in any way, and I think that's pretty obvious to see. So an opportunity to get people back on track and say, hey, do you actually care about free speech or not?
Yep.
I also want to take issue with some of the framing around free speech, because when you listen to it, I can see why someone might fall into the narrative, because what they're distinguishing between is like American citizens having free speech
Mhm.
or people visiting here on visas, what have you. We are actually relitigating this. This is something that has already been decided. It was not a right that was given to American citizens.
Mhm.
There wasn't anything that's said that. So the fact that they're bringing it up as if that hadn't been decided, I definitely take issue with it.
Mhm. And that's what they do with everything. It's
Yeah.
like settled
I was
law,
like,
all these things. It's like, let's take another look at that as though we made a mistake. And I had been hoping that people would kind of get tired of that at some point. Apparently not. Apparently we're up for the fight. But what all of this has made me think about too is, this isn't new. So the BDS movement has had the same issues at colleges that we are seeing now, and have been, speakers have been canceled or said they can't speak at a college. There's been protests, there was action. It wasn't nearly as big as what is happening now. But I came across a quote from Judith Butler, who's a feminist philosopher, and I found the quote outside of the context of where it was said, and then I found where the context was. What the quote is: "The principle of academic freedom is designed to make sure that powers outside the university, including government and corporations, are not able to control the curriculum or intervene in extramural speech. It not only bars such interventions, but it also protects those platforms in which we might be able to reflect together on the most difficult problems." And turns out she said that in the context of almost being banned from speaking at a university in Brooklyn in 2013. Then she was able to speak in some way, but it was different and changed because she is a supporter of the BDS movement. And so, like, we've been having this conversation for a while. It's just now they're taking the right, in Trump and his whole team is taking advantage of a issue that's been bubbling for a long time. And they see it as really ripe and easy for exploiting because people have complicated feelings about it. They're more easily swayed one way or the other based on what is happening in the moment. Unfortunately, they're quite good at taking advantage of this moment. Of course, like, the more recent beginnings of this was right-wing Nazis getting told they can't speak at college campuses and them making a huge deal out of that and saying that the left is assaulting free speech. If you're wanting to talk about free speech absolutism, that's a different conversation. But I think because this has always been squishy in our politics and in our national conversation, it's easy to exploit. And that's what they're doing. We're living in a very kind of chaotic and complex world while having complicated and complex conversations, and the one side with the biggest microphone is exploiting every single angle possible.
Yeah, and this is one of those things that is absolutely baked into the system. It's said regularly that democratic societies have the seeds of their own destruction built into them
Right.
yeah.
because free speech is absolutely necessary for freedom in a society, but it is exactly what gets exploited by those who would do away with democracy entirely. So this is a tension that will never go away. It is a debate that will never be solved. And we just need to understand it as baked into the system as a balancing act. That is what it is. It is something to be balanced now, into the future, in perpetuity. It doesn't get solved permanently. And another thing that often also is said, freedom and democracy are things that every generation needs to sort of continue to win. You have to continue to reaffirm a desire for democracy because it is the sort of thing that will slip away or be taken away the moment you let your guard down. The debate over, Berkeley and whatever left-wing students trying to not have Nazis speak on their campus, it's obvious why people would react that way. Normalizing Nazis is not a good way to uphold democratic values. The warning on the other side is the more the door is open to restricting speech, the more the authoritarian right will take advantage of that and go so much farther than the left ever would in terms of restricting speech. And that's what we're seeing now. Now, I don't love that framing because it sounds as though, like, well, the right wouldn't be doing this if the left hadn't started it. And like, that's bullshit, but it's part of the balancing act. The more closely we adhere to something nearly free speech absolutism, but probably not all the way, but like something close, the farther the right has to go to pull it in the other direction to say, well, so someone said something bad about Israel, so they should be renditioned, like that's sort of the argument. But when you vote in a clearly authoritarian president who has already been in office once before, and you kind of know his deal and you know the writing on the wall, and he has learned through experience. I read a long form piece about Trump's reemergence from the wilderness during the Biden years. And the thing that stuck out to me the most was the lesson they learned was, so they described in his first term, he had a bunch of aides who were telling him, don't touch the stove, it's hot. And so he'd be like, well, okay, I guess I can't touch the stove. And in the second term, what they learned is those aides were literally wrong. It turns out the stove isn't hot, that he can do things, he can implement policies, and there is not a reaction. He does not get burned. And that's not his fault. That's not his over the top authoritarianism bulldozing consequences. That is the failure of the system, the failure of politicians who are in the system, the failure of the Justice Department for not reacting quickly enough. All of those things, like, the stove was not hot. We allowed the stove to go cold, and now he knows it. And so he knows he can rendition people, and like, he's probably just going to get away with it because the stove isn't hot. So that was going to happen no matter what, because he was taught through experience that he can. And that has nothing to do with what the left said about Milo Yiannopoulos 15 years ago.
The other thing about this that, I mean, yes, it is big news that Trump is attacking universities, but the angle that I don't see emphasized enough, I do think it was at least briefly mentioned in this article that we read, is the fact that he's attacking private institutions. And that should be seen as like a grotesque overreach. Like, we should all be more shocked by that than we are. And I find it a symptom of our times where we are kind of numb to so much that we don't see that as the problem, that the government has no rights or authority over private education institutions. Like, that should be shocking. And Vance and Trump and the way they talk about it is like, nope, this is just what you got to do. If you want to have a country, this is what you got to do. It's very matter of fact. It is not matter of fact. The Ivies, higher education in general, they have a lot of problems. I have a lot of criticisms, I'm sure we all do, about the way these institutions are run, how they operate, etc. But in this situation, I feel the same way I feel about private companies. I also have a lot of issues and concerns with private companies. They have a lot of problems, but if the government starts saying which companies can exist and which can't, we have a problem. We have a very, very big problem. And, if they go after one or a handful and say, your rules are different than everyone else's, which is exactly what is happening, that's a big fucking problem. And so the whole situation is so much more inflammatory than I think we are all as a country like recognizing. I don't care if they get research money from the government. Tons of organizations and institutions get money from the government. That doesn't give them any authority to intervene on this level in a private institution.
Which is a perfect transition because I wanted to wrap up that article with this line about the futility of universities trying to capitulate. So it says, there is little to be gained by collaborating with the Trump administration anyway, because Trump himself doesn't respect weakness. If a college decides not to stand up to him, he will seek to take more and more. He will keep pushing until he's broken the institution, end quote, because that's the whole point. It's not about Israel. It's not about anti Semitism. It's not about free speech. It's about reducing the capacity of the country to educate people in a way that would make them oppose Trumpism. Because the
Mhm.
more you know, the more you are not in favor of his bullshit. But what you just led to is I pulled this extra quote from an article we read a while ago, but it never made it into the show. This is from The New Yorker. Molly Fisher interviewed Michael Roth, the president of Wesleyan, in the article, A University President Makes a Case Against Cowardice. And Michael Roth makes this point that Amanda was alluding to better than anyone I've heard. So he says at a little bit of length, quote, people have said to me, well, you take all that money from the government. Why don't you listen to them? The answer is because the money doesn't come with a loyalty oath. And that has served the country so well because Americans and various governments we've had recognized that it's better for the country if people can practice freedom. The government's not going to tell you how to run your business. It starts with universities because universities are this object of resentment and this kind of weird charisma, negative and positive. It starts with that, but it could very easily go into these other aspects of this culture that, again, depend on the government. I don't have to agree with the mayor to get the fire department to come put out a fire. And that's what they're saying to these international students. Well, you came to this country. What makes you think you can write an op ed in the newspaper? Well, what makes you think that is this is a free country? End quote.
What's so frustrating about even that line of attack is when those students are writing these op-eds, there are millions of Americans who agree with that position. They are trying to
Mhm.
say that this position that they are saying is anti-American
Right.
when clearly four of us here probably agree with the people writing those op-eds a whole hell of a lot more than the Trump administration.
Mhm.
They have decided that Trump is America.
Mhm.
America is embodied by what Trump is. That is all that's at stake. That's all that's being said. And we have to flatly reject that. And every single college or university, even if they agree with them, even if like your Liberty University, you might want to take a step back and say, wait, is Trump America?
Right. And on that point, the right has been incensed that their bad old ideas that they don't ever want to reevaluate. I mean, trickle down economics for one. We have like all this data that this isn't a great idea anymore, but they're like, no, this should be taught in colleges. Like they started to try to push back against what they saw as liberal higher education with things like Liberty University and those extreme Christian universities. And that didn't seem to work as well as I think they hoped, and now they're like, "Well, those institutions are full of liberal professors." JD Vance was talking about how the voting patterns of university professors are so one-sided that they look like the election results of North Korea. Yeah, of course they're one-sided. That's a ridiculous, ridiculous framing. Like, there are more liberal professors in higher education because who is more open to new ideas? Who is uniformly against oppression? Like, conservatives support oppression when it fits their needs. They're not open to evaluating old ideas and thinking like maybe we should change things and move forward with new evidence. That's not really their go-to. And I'm speaking obviously very generally. So it's not surprising. And if you are adamant that old things that have been debunked need to be taught as though that's an equalizer in some way, that's a true indoctrination. Forcing an ideology despite all the evidence undercutting it, that is indoctrination.
Which takes us right to our next category. But first, I have to mention that I just saw Josh Hawley grilling an expert, like a legal expert, in a Senate meeting. And the line of questioning was about how bizarre it is that Trump is having so many rulings against him. And it's like so far out of whack with the norm that it must be that Democrat judges are
Yeah.
targeting him. And the expert is like, well, I mean, you kind of have to consider the possibility that he's actually acting more lawlessly than other presidents, and that would like also explain the same phenomenon you're describing. It's like, oh yeah,
Yeah.
like all those highly educated people being more on the left. Shocking. Like, I wonder how that happened. It must be a conspiracy.
There's this conspiracy against Jeffrey Dahmer. Like, okay, he's got all these heads in his freezer, but you're saying he's more likely to be a cannibal than anybody else? I think it's an oppression
Yeah.
against Jeffrey Dahmer. Like,
Yeah.
that's Josh Hawley is, I mean, he's not, I was going to say a disappointment, but he's never disappointing. He is exactly who he is. He always says something occasionally, like he's maybe gonna not vote for this
Right.
massive Medicare cut because it's just bad for the state of Missouri. But of course he'll vote for it because he can make that argument. And he went to those elite schools just like JD Vance,
Yep.
just like everybody saying all these things as if going to an elite school automatically turns you into a communist.
Yeah.
Clearly it doesn't,
No.
because
Clearly it
they're
doesn't.
all running the country now.
Ted Cruz, all of them. Yep.
Well,
Yeah.
they go to those elite colleges and then they use the education that they gain to gain access to powerful
Right.
positions and then reframe arguments like almost pandering to a base that like doesn't have that college education. Like these arguments are so bad that like it's hard not to question if they're genuine or not.
I object to that framing, Erin, because you used the word almost.
I wasn't going to quibble, but
All right. Speaking of, pandering to people in a way that disempowers them, our next topic is from the New York Magazine. Isabel Christo wrote, "There's no Trumponomics without the Tradwife." And the writer starts out by highlighting that the cultural interest in there being some sort of reversion to a traditional lifestyle stems from legitimate criticisms of our like shredding social fabric and the problems of alienation under capitalism. But the path being charted then is geared to unquestionably benefit men over women, except in their fantasies where women collectively realize that, actually it would be better to be dependent on my husband's income so that I can stay home and do housework and raise kids, right? And it feels like we've tried that before, and women found that to be less than ideal, like enough of them that it became a cultural touch point and pivotal moment in the history of the country when they rebelled against that system. But we could try it again, see how it goes. So the article says, quote, "The crisis of disaffected men will be solved, we're told, through emotional connection and dignity through work. under the covenant of Trumponomics, women and all the loving care and babies they provide will be man's reward for his manual labor, while her unwaged domestic labor becomes essential to an economy made up of single-income American households, each headed by a stoic Trumpist patriarch. And then just describing the phenomenon a bit more, it says, quote, after all, the industrial utopia can only come to pass if the men rediscovering their virality on the assembly line aren't expected to come home from a long day at the shoe factory to make their own dinner. The promise of trad masculinity has to be matched one for one with the dream of tradwifery, end quote.
Oh, yeah.
Is that how that's pronounced?
I went old school. That's
Okay.
how I've heard it because no one's
Yeah, like
used.
midwifery.
Yeah, exactly. No
Yeah.
one's
Yeah.
used the term, in 200 years, but yeah, I think midwifery is what I was being inspired by.
I mean, if we're gonna do some stupid shit from 200
Yeah.
years ago, we probably should bring out
We should
pronunciations
say
too.
it.
That makes a lot of sense.
Exactly. And then diving into the phenomenon of tradwifery a bit more, this is the most interesting quote I pulled from this article, and it's actually quoting another writer, Zoe Hu, from Dissent magazine, who said, quote, what unites tradwives is their rejection of both capitalism and feminism, which are conflated in the gloomy figure of the working woman, end quote. And I mean, like, it's so obvious to us, but it's painful to realize that people are being tricked by because they don't like see what's being done, is that the gloominess of the working woman might be a totally real thing, but it's entirely about capitalism and nothing to do with the gender of the person working.
Right.
Like,
They're gloomy men.
exactly.
It's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah. The only relevance is that, I mean, I guess in their framing, they're like, men must labor. They don't have a choice. So they could be in an office job doing, email jobs, or they could be in a factory, which would be manly and cool. And so the alternative for women that's presented to the gloomy vision is you could be at home doing, it says, quote,
Laboring.
yeah, the more tactile and patriotic labor of childcare or housework, or domestic manufacturing. If you're like doing a side gig at home, making soap and selling it, or doing a multi-level marketing scam or something like that, then like that's all patriotic and good. And they argue is better than like a real job that pays real wages and is shitty because of capitalism, but better because at least you have money and some degree of freedom.
I love the ways in which women are positioned in arguments and like often framed in a way that's like, we really care about women. So let's endorse this terrible thing that makes their lives like exponentially worse.
Mhm, mhm.
So I've been tracking this for a while. Charlie Kirk went to Cambridge and, he was doing what he does best, which is debate college students. So in the argument, they were talking about women, and essentially the argument was that women are miserable in this girl boss era, and what would make them feel a lot better is having more children and getting married earlier. And like his entire arguments were in the way of what will make women happier. And the woman that he was debating did an excellent job combating him on those. So I don't need to go through that. What I was thinking the whole time is how reductionist this is to men. I think in our society, we have put a lot of weight on gender instead of looking at ourselves as a species. And there are general things that humans need in order to be happy. And it is not manual labor and sex and food. It's not that simple. There's a lot of complexities that go into it. And like the arguments as if we'll bring manufacturing back and men will just be, as happy as they were in the 1950s and the 1960s.
Mhm.
And so like knowing what I do was like, no, I got to check these because I know there is stuff going on with men's health that we're glossing over and trying to make it seem like manual labor and that masculinity is what's going to bring us to happiness. You find things from the 1950s to the 1980s, such as high suicide rates for men, high alcohol consumption,
Mhm.
heart disease, like off the chart, people, men dying from heart attacks, which is still relevant.
Mhm.
But when you track it through time, what you see is like the times that these kind of even out have to do a lot with gender equality. And I'm not saying that's the only thing that's going on in those errors. It's a lot more complex. And I'm not going to do the mistake that he did, which is correlation for causation.
Mhm.
But, you know, if this were to be true during the 1980s, 1990s, into the early 2000s, if all of these rates were like stagnating, the weight behind what he's saying just like it doesn't correlate with the data that we have.
Mhm.
It doesn't lead to like, yes, men were very happy because that stoic, like I love that the article referenced the word stoic because that exactly points to it. And I am sorry to men because for too long they have been told that the only thing they can offer is their manual labor, their like
Their
physical
bodies, yeah.
abilities, their bodies. You can protect us, you can put your body on the line by joining the military, or you can do manual labor and bring home the paycheck. The reality is you have more to offer than that. And I do agree with Amanda from a couple episodes back. Men haven't been told enough. We are letting the
Mhm.
right talk to men instead of addressing them.
Yeah, they haven't been told they have inherent value.
Yeah,
Mhm.
like we need to instill that because I think it's something that men like scoff off, but it's something that they need to be told. You have to know that you contribute so much more beyond your physical ability.
A couple things. One, agree with everything you just said, Erin. Two, I'm not a free speech absolutist in any way, shape, or form, specifically because of this Charlie Kirk debating at Oxford and Cambridge thing. I think he hasn't debated at Oxford yet, but he's going to.
Yeah, it's terrible.
He won that debate just by being there.
Mhm.
Him saying his hateful, ridiculous nonsense and being put on a level playing field with every single smart, educated, thoughtful person he went against. He was seen as equal, and you just agree with him whether, you like his bullshit or not. So that kind of unrelated to the point. He won that debate just by being there.
Well, and minor point, on his side, it was a bunch of young men who are looking up to him and nodding along as if he is making valid points,
Exactly.
despite being countered with actual statistics and data.
Mhm.
Sorry, continue.
But there is a counter for this. This thing that they're offering, like, Jay said, tradwifery, because it's a silly, outdated, ridiculous program that they want for us. Meanwhile, recently I read a couple different articles about Iceland experimenting with the 4-day work week and results coming back in. They started about 2015 with just a small sample size, and then they really ramped it up in 2019. And the results have been really good. People are staying at home more. They're having better connections at home. Men aren't just laboring because they have more time to be at home. They are also doing more housework, which makes the women who are also laboring
Mhm.
but doing less housework maybe more equality, and people are happier. They didn't lower incomes. They mandated that
Right.
incomes stay exactly the same with lowered work rates. They also digitized a lot of things. They're doing something that is trying to go into the future, something that we've been talking about for a long time in this country about, developments in technology. Maybe we're going to work less.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we have these massive developments in technology that are happening all around us. Simultaneously, they're telling us we need to work more. We need to be home less. The only thing we can do is work more. And women, you're going to work more too, just in an old school way, separate from men. And that is, I guess, the key to all this is that if you keep men and women apart, they'll be happier, which I've never understood this whole idea
Yeah.
that men should just be with men and that they will be happier. I do not fundamentally understand this, but this does seem to be a thing that people like Charlie Kirk are saying.
Yeah.
Guys just need to be with guys all the time. And I think they would be happier if maybe they realized they want to spend more time with guys than they do with women because they don't like women
Mhm.
except for as sex objects. And that's a huge part of this.
Mhm.
They don't like women, and they should work on that part of it. Why is it that you don't like women so much?
Right.
What is it about
Explore
spending
that a
time
bit.
with women? Yeah. What is it about spending time with women that makes you feel so bad? Like, there's so much going on with that. That could be a whole series of podcasts, obviously.
Yeah.
But fundamentally, what they're offering is tried, true bullshit from the past that we know doesn't work. And what is available could work. There are plenty of other options. We could go forward. We could work less. This country needs to accept that manual labor, doing jobs, isn't all of it. You can do a lot of things and not be on the clock. If you want to occupy your time, there are plenty of things to do to occupy your time other than punching in and making widgets.
Mhm. Well, on that note, the beginning of this article mentioned a poll from the Cato Institute and says a poll from last summer found that 80% of Americans believe the country would be better off if more of us worked in manufacturing than we currently do. And that raised every alarm bell and red flag in my head. I was like, I don't think that's the whole story at all. And they allude that maybe it won't be the whole story, but they didn't get into the details. So I went and I found the poll and I also found some other articles about the poll. And they point out that, yeah, 80% of the respondents said that the country would be better off if more of us worked in manufacturing. But when asked, I would be better off if I worked in a factory instead of my current field of work,
No.
25% agreed with that statement.
Yeah, not me though.
25%.
Oh,
It's huge.
God.
It's such an amazing, it's such a clear example of the phenomenon that everyone thinks something they don't want to do would be really good for someone else. And then only 7% of respondents strongly agreed. It was 80% said agree. Only 7% that said they strongly agreed. 2% of the respondents actually worked in manufacturing. So there's a lot to unpack there, and we could dissect it for a long time, but this isn't actually what people want. They think, because I think of what Deon said, like these are old ideas and we look back on the past with these strange fondness or like things were simpler and better then. Of course they weren't. People get diluted. The reality is that people would not actually want this.
Well, and we kind of debunked the health of our economy should not be based in manufacturing jobs. Like we, in a past episode, discussed the progression of society. You should move past manufacturing, and we have, which lets you know, like we are 100% losing the narrative in so many realms. But I have to be the annoying progressive, and I know all of us know this, but just to say it, this reality of a single income household has also not been reality for most people, like
Mhm.
especially lower class BIPOC people. Like not everyone gains access. And
Mhm.
if you were able to gain access, they would just start paying you more. They would
Right.
support raising the minimum wage. You would see action towards making a more robust, economically stable, lower and middle class.
And I'm not gonna throw a ton more stats here, but on that point, 65% of those respondents believe we've lost manufacturing due to offshoring jobs, and only 35% believe that those jobs have disappeared due to robots and technology. And the reality is we're going to lose hundreds of millions of jobs to automation. And that means that it's not just about bringing back the manufacturing jobs. We did a whole episode that delved into this previously, our masculinity episode. The future is not, oh, we can just have this again. It's not going to be possible.
And then I guess we're just on a roll saying things that everyone feels like they already know, but I need to be the progressive who points out that the reason people feel positively and fondly about a past era of high manufacturing is because they were unionized jobs. And they're
Yeah.
not looking to
Mhm.
bring unions back. They're looking
Right.
to put
No.
people to
No.
work. You remember that the Trump administration dude was like, we're going to have a bunch of people screwing in those tiny screws into
Right.
iPhones.
Right.
And they're definitely not going to let those people be unionized. So that's their vision when they say it out loud. And
Mhm.
so those 80% of Americans who, like, maybe not for me, but for someone else, it'd be good to have manufacturing. They're imagining the past in the New Deal FDR era of high unionization that led to factory jobs being high paid jobs for those who could get them.
And Amanda's point, Howard Lutnick said that, and in that same interview that he said that about the screwing in things, also said robots are going to do a whole bunch of jobs here. It's going to be amazing. Same
I
interview.
can't wait.
Yep.
So
I
Same
can't
interview.
wait. So this next quote, taking this in a new direction, this one like really triggered something interesting for me. Moira Donegan in The Guardian writes, so quoting yet another writer within this article, and they say, quote, Trump is drawing on a long tradition of economic rhetoric that aims to cast consumption as feminine, decadent, and morally suspect, and to contrast it with the supposedly more manly and virtuous productive side of the economy, end quote. So what this connects to is, and I hate to bring up Charlie Kirk twice in one show, but we talked about Charlie Kirk and Megyn Kelly fighting about dating etiquette and whether men should be expected to pay for dates in a new age of feminism and equality. And we all agreed, yeah, we're shifting toward equality. We're in a transition period. And this debate over like who should pay for what is a hangover from the time when women literally didn't have access to money. And so there was no debate. Of course, the man was going to pay because the woman didn't have any money. And now, like culturally, we're experiencing the hangover of this. And I would argue that what was just described in that quote is very similar. Like the entire cultural perception of women as the ones who like to frivolously spend hard-earned money stems from that same period when the men were the ones who worked because women were basically not allowed, and their wives were the ones who were going shopping like for food and necessities of life and maybe other things. And then the cultural perception was, I earn all the money and my wife goes and spends it. Take my wife, please, right? Like it's all the same shit. And then this follow-up quote says, quote, pro-natalist movements tend to rear their heads in moments of widespread anxiety around gender roles in politics and work, such as in the 1920s, directly following women's suffrage, and such as we're seeing now. So using the perverse backward bullshit of the previous era when women had no access to money, which framed them then as the frivolous spenders of money, the consumers, rather than the producers, is now being brought back and flipped so that it's basically being argued that women shouldn't work because they're not producers. Just like the snake eating its own tail. And obviously, I mean, I read the second quote because like it's just men feeling insecure, which is why they don't like being around women, because competent women make incompetent men feel insecure. And so they're like, well, I could either go to therapy or I could reorganize all of society and oppress whatever it is, 51% of the population to make me feel better.
If only we would have known the argument against the $400 million plane was that was very feminine. Like we could have just feminized the whole argument against it and made Trump actually not want that very decadent, frivolous jet.
I'm going to disagree with you. I'm going to disagree with you pretty hard.
Oh no, of course it's bullshit. That's the
but
gag.
He's not buying it. He's winning the deal. He's manly taking this massive.
Although I think he did go pick it out, is what we learned later. So I don't know.
Yeah, and and he also was picking out the curtains in the White House, and he's also
gilding everything
choosing
in
the
gold.
decor. It is amazing that this message is coming from Donald Trump, of all people in America. The most, I mean, he should be talking about New York plays. He should be talking about celebrity drama. That's what he should be doing.
Yep.
He's good at that stuff. That's what he really wants to do fundamentally, because he's just that guy. He's not a macho man. He's never going to work in a factory. He never could have worked in a factory. At no point in his life was he ever going to start a fire.
He just found out what groceries are. The guy's,
he made up that. He created
he invented that word?
Probably.
I don't know if he invented that one.
But also, and I want to go back just a little bit and just point out how Jay is a healthier person than I am. Matt Walsh is the person that was arguing with Megyn
Oh,
Kelly,
good.
not Charlie Kirk.
Oh.
They are different people, and the fact that you
Yeah.
don't know that they're different people says a lot about you as a person, and I
I
admire
appreciate that.
because I do know
Well,
that they're
Yeah,
different people.
I'm happy to be wrong about that.
Yeah.
I mean, mentioning the 1920s, the post-suffrage obsession with traditional gender roles is interesting. I always think about post-World War II, because during World War II, women were doing the work that was quote unquote the men's work. And then immediately after, everyone was like, listen, the men are home. Can you just go back to the house? We'll cater all of our advertising to you because you'll be the one buying vacuums and cleaning products and stuff for your kids. And, and we'll just forget all this ever happened. Right. Okay. And like that, the 50s really are, I mean, not that there weren't subversive movements and all sorts of things happening, but dominant culture was extremely rigid. And it came after a period where women realized, like, oh, we can do this. Like, we've finally been allowed to, and we can do this. How many didn't really want to leave those jobs at the end? Like, I'm sure there's many things have been written about that, and I'll have to go down that rabbit hole.
And it turns out you can do all of that and housework. Wow.
Right.
So my takeaway is that the problem with feminism is that they didn't bother to solve capitalism and the drudgery of corporate serfdom while at the same time freeing women from the drudgery of familial serfdom.
Yeah.
Like
those lazy feminists.
Thank
They
you.
didn't
Thank
fix
you.
everything. God.
They should have done both, but since they didn't, they just allowed themselves to also be consumed by the horrific world of corporate capitalism. And now we're having the tradwife backlash, which probably could have been predicted by someone paying attention. But our next article sort of makes the case that fighting for civil rights does come much easier if you hold back from making bigger criticisms of the structures that we all live under at the same time. And so, like we say, the curse of being a progressive is being right, but too soon, and having to fight the wars you're fighting while bringing people along with you, which actually kind of means tempering your message in order to have success. Whereas if you just say what's flat out right and true from the beginning, you'll alienate people. So we'll get very angry about this article for good and ill. This is from Jacobin. To stop losing the culture wars, learn from gay marriage. This is Joan Williams writing. And so starting out, just like some baseline structures of the culture wars that I liked. It says, quote, culture wars are part of the deep structure of populism. To quote Democratic strategist David Kusnet, there are two populist messages. One, left populism. They're robbing you blind. Number two, right populism. They think they're better than you. Progressives should stick to number one and not fall into number two. And then it explains that in both recipes, the magic ingredient is resentment. The only question is whether it will be directed at the economic elites, those robbing you blind, or the cultural elites who think they're better than you. And so it talks about how far-right populism deflects anger away from economic elites so they can rob you blind onto what they dub cultural elites. And it says that this works because social class is expressed not just through economics, but also through profound cultural differences. One central cultural fissure is the divide between self-development and self-discipline. And this was, I think, revelatory. I mean, it's like a definite reframing of things in a way I hadn't heard before, and I kind of had to read it a couple of times. So here's the explanation. Disciplined workers, this is the divide, right? The self-discipline versus self-development. So the disciplined workers, those are people who have jobs that require subservience to survive. You got to be a good worker. You got to do what your boss says. You don't want to make waves. You have to just buckle down and do what needs to be done. And you can find pride in that, right? Like you can say, like, I'm doing the work and I'm providing for my family, and this is the work that's available. I'm doing it. And if I need to just be self disciplined, then that's fine. But that is in contrast with the self improvement or the self development people who are more like the managers or the cultural sophisticates, because their economic and social standing is tied not to their ability to just like buckle down and do the work, but to improve themselves, to better themselves and advance in their career, or know lots of cultural references so that they can impress their rich friends, that sort of thing. So there's actually culturally different values that are connected to these ways of life that people get stuck in depending on what path they're on. Not everyone can be the manager, not everyone can be a social climber, and so it actually requires different social values to survive on each of those tracks.
I thought that the article kind of made it seem like, because the data alludes to it, that as we scale the income ladder, there's more support for gay marriage. And that may be true, but I think it's true for different reasons than are alluded to. I guess I would maybe argue that like exposure to different people through going to different environments like college, or going to your job where maybe you're in a diverse city, or maybe you moved for that job. So there's that, like, exposure that I think is different because you're in a higher income bracket. You may experience that kind of life where you run into more people who are different from you, which can open your mind and change how you think. And then if you are not just economically stable, but, like, completely secure, really established in your economic security, then you probably don't fear others as much or worry that they're getting something more than you, or in this case, getting something you feel is special to you, like traditional gender role marriage. And like middle income people are worrying more about the Joneses and are always looking upwards, and they're uncomfortable with how much closer they are to the poor than the actual elites. And so they think they have to build these walls. And I'm speaking very generally, obviously. But I think, there is this aspect of a certain income bracket that many think that they're destined for something greater, and if they don't get it, it's easier to think it's because someone took it from them. And so that comes not into just gay marriage and gay rights, but like, immigrants and segregation back in the day, and all these things where like they fear more than someone who is really stable economically.
Yeah, I think you're adding on to what the article says, because it kind of talks about how people at the higher economic levels are more supportive of gay rights because it goes along with the culture of the people that they're around, and it's seen as more socially sophisticated to think that way. And I think it's just a yes, and you're describing sort of the nuts and bolts of how that culture gets built. But also, if you rise up economically and socially, then you're going to end up rubbing elbows with people who have done that same thing and come to those
Mhm.
same conclusions, right? So the inverse of it, how the valuing of discipline as opposed to the self-improvement, how the discipline plays out in the real world, it says, quote, the lower the education level, the higher the endorsement of traditional gender roles. This makes sense. In the eternal scrum for social honor, class ideals are unattainable, but non elites can attain gender ideals. It is impossible to become a billionaire, but it is possible through self discipline to be a real man, end quote. So people sort of consciously or unconsciously, for the most part, I would say, recognizing the limitations that they are bumping up against, then sort of strive toward that which is the most attainable. And the lower on the economic ladder, the more it's like, well, I can't get higher economically or very much higher, but here's what I can do. I can grind, or I
Right.
can work out, or demean women. All those good things men like to do.
It's another one of those like Trump being seen as masculine. Like nothing about him screams self-discipline, right? One of the least disciplined people in the world. There's recently an incredible military maneuver. Ukraine took about 150,000 drones and destroyed somewhere in the neighborhood of $24 billion worth of Russian long-range nuclear-capable planes. And it's being talked about in the sense that it's a 18-month plan. So while Zelensky was in the office getting dressed down by Donald Trump and JD Vance and people telling him, why aren't you wearing a suit? These manly of men. This guy kept all that quiet and didn't cause too much of a scene, didn't push back too much, stood his ground, but quietly, carefully, in a very manly way, took the abuse and then didn't say anything about this. Like Trump even said, you don't have the cards. Meanwhile, he's doing this, like, knows this operation's happening. I say all that to say, if you're taking your cues from a Republican Party headed by JD Vance and Donald Trump on how to be manly and how to move forward and how to do any of these things, you're already lost. That's not the way forward for anybody. And these people having hijacked these cultural norms of masculinity is going to make it even more difficult to find out what masculinity even means. It's just getting so muddled now in just ridiculous tropes, because that's all it really is. It's just tropes. There's not any action behind it. So what are people doing but just performing? And it's becoming more and more difficult to say even what they are performing when the people in charge are just a mess of nonsense. Like, I don't even know how to describe these people, and masculine wouldn't be the word I would use. So this is just one of those opportunities now. It's all out there. We could take this back. We could define what these roles really are, what masculinity and femininity actually mean, what they don't mean, and how they intermingle, and how they're not as rigid as everyone has ever said. Because if Donald Trump is the ideal of masculinity now, then I think we can say that masculinity is pretty flexible. It's not as rigid as we once thought. So we could go forward in a different way and say, hey, let's get past this rigid black and white thinking. We could do that. Are we going to do it?
Definitely.
I have no idea. Definitely.
Sure, why not? Now, the next piece is analyzing this same divide, the discipline and the self-improvement, but instead of in individual lives, in politics. And so it says, quote, the right's "they're looking down on you" narrative taps something real. Cultural elites do think of themselves as enlightened and of non-elites as backward deplorables. Conservative elites understand the dynamics of culture wars far better than liberals do, end quote. And this really helped something click for me. I mean, I've always been economically populist. Let's do all the things, the high taxes and the redistribution and the Medicare for all and whatnot. But this framing and the understanding of these two opposing populist narratives and the realization that what we have is the Republicans tapping into one of them and Democrats tapping into neither of them. That is the fundamental imbalance here. So populism is incredibly powerful. It taps into resentment and anger, which is extremely motivating. And you've got a couple options you can play with. Who do you want your supporters to be angry at? Like that's the slate of options we have. And the Democrats have gone with like nothing. They shouldn't really be angry at anything. They should just understand that we're nice and calm administrators of government, and they should elect us for that reason. Meanwhile, the Republicans are tapping into like those eggheads think you're an idiot, so you can't elect them because they don't like you and look down on you. And it's like right at their fingertips. The Democrats could simply just rail against the oligarchy and get people mad about that because it's the most legitimate thing to be mad about. This is the whole argument of why the culture wars are bullshit. It's because other people's lives don't have anything to do with you. How people live their lives doesn't actually impact you. But when oligarchy takes hold and all the wealth is funneled to the top, that does impact you. You should be pissed off about that. So why the Democrats don't just come out and say that full throatedly is, I mean, it's not beyond me. I know why they do it because of their donor class, but how they don't see that they have put themselves in an impossible bind is a little bit beyond me. Given where we are politically, how they don't universally understand the need for a major shift is shocking. Getting back to the focus about marriage equality, this quote brings us into the heart of the debate we're using as a lens to understand all of this. It says, quote, "Here's an oft forgotten fact. Gay marriage was not a priority for many in the gay liberation movement. In the 1990s, many leaders saw marriage as patriarchal and would have preferred a different battle. But," it says, "when the gay liberation movement pivoted to gay marriage, it demonstrated literacy in the values of ordinary Americans and modeled how to invite them into the struggle for social justice without condescension." And here's the tension. Here's the tension for any progressive who would agree with the what would have been considered the elites of the gay liberation movement, that discrimination and why are we fighting for marriage when marriage is a patriarchal concept? Like, we should be leapfrogging that. But the battle for marriage equality was not only extremely successful in its own right, but was the vehicle that helped homophobia generally be vastly reduced in society. And so that's the frustrating balance progressives end up having to strike over and over again, leading to half measures and like how just like the failure of the feminists to not overthrow capitalism. It's like, well, yeah, I mean, okay, progress, but progress to what end? How thrilled are we with the end result? Progress is good, but there's always more work to be done.
And it turns out that gay people getting married does not overthrow the systems that make marriages fail or contentious or a power dynamic even.
Mhm.
Yeah, I struggle with that just, being in the queer community. I didn't disagree with the framing. Obviously, this author added notes that kind of put the nuance on it. But it does, in doing the respectability, we also set the precedent that we are the same. That was a lot of the dialogue around
Mhm.
marriage equality is just look at us and see we're human.
Yeah,
We're the same
love
as
is
you. We
love.
want to get married. Love is love. And like that did wonders. You're right. Homophobia and things like that, the rates now and just the popularity. But in doing that, we did move away, especially from trans individuals in the community, because the thing about transness and fighting back against the gender binary is that there's no we're the same. There has been a line that has divided. And I think people have chosen that gay can be okay. But this gender bending that happens within the community, that's a line. We cannot have the flexibility for that. So I think there were choices that were made, and it's hard now to look back and say what you could have added or what you could have done differently because like we only have what happened and those are the stats that we can evaluate. I do wish that there was a better way and a further push that happened because in a lot of ways it felt like marriage equality was the end marker instead of the beginning. And we're still seeing that backlash. Gay people are still being equated to groomers. There are still stigmas
Right.
that exist that need to be continuously worked on. And I'm not saying that there's one solution that will make that go away. As we've seen through history, homophobia flares up at different periods.
Mhm.
Also, when you're seeing economic inequality and things like that come up. So it's always going to be an issue, but it feels very complicated,
Mhm.
so, of course, we have to add the nuances.
I think it is very complicated. I mean, it is not exactly the same, but it does remind me of why desegregation in schools became the leading charge during the civil rights movement, and that was, of
Yeah.
course, because white liberals were getting involved, and they kind of guided that direction. It might have been a little bit different in this movement, but I guess it's something you can look back on throughout many different movements that like what ends up actually coming out of a movement may not be what the core missions were to begin with. Maybe it assuages some things and helps with some things, but the underlying problems are still there. And so, of course, those start to rear their head. Give it a decade or two, you start to see them again. I think that what I would maybe like disagree with about this article is this is not a playbook. I don't actually think it's a perfectly replicatable playbook. I think there are some lessons to be learned, but I don't think it's so easy to translate the gay marriage movement to some of the things that we're trying to do now. I think it's much messier than that.
And there's also the aspect that gay marriage might go away. It's not set in stone. This is not something that has been fought for, won, and now we're moving on. We're not moving on. Like respectability politics has such limitations. Just compare and contrast. Obama married one woman, two beautiful children, did all the right things, went to the right schools, said all the right things. Trump, multiple children by multiple women, cheated on every woman he's ever been with. The shadow president for months and months. Elon Musk, 14, 15, 16 kids by
Unknowable at this
14,
point.
15, 16 different women,
Mhm.
clearly intoxicated on something, probably ketamine, while in public, while in the White House, and is still a main figure in the Republican Party. You can try to conform to whatever the moral norms are to a point, but that doesn't mean acceptability or acceptance is around the corner. And clearly, gay marriage was fought for and won. And I think homophobia is worse today than it was 5 years ago. I think racism is worse today than it was 12 years ago. Like trying to do whatever it takes to fit in with the majority culture doesn't mean you will fit in with the majority culture.
Well, and I might not say worse, I might say intensified, 'cause I don't know percentage-wise if there's more
Sure.
people who are, but I do think the intensity, and to Dion's point about, the potentiality of gay marriage being overturned, like, the argument they are making is the exact counter to what normalized it, which is it's not the same. Marriage between a man and a woman is not the same between 2 men, 2 women, or non-binary people, just to add my progressive annoyance. But, I mean, like, we're going back to that, so, yes, it made progress, and I do think a little bit of this is always gonna happen in society where you progress and then some pushback is faced, but the fact that we're now so removed from the fight of it, that it's seeming like it would be okay if we had civil unions versus marriage, when civil unions in some places were legal at the time, and it was not viewed as the same thing, because that's not actual true equity, equality. Yeah.
We're moving on to the next article, and this is pulling way out, right? This is just zooming out to look at these cultural fights that we're having now and recognizing that we have been having them all for a long time and they just keep getting rehashed. So, this from the New York Times is called Why We Can't Quit These Evergreen Arguments. And I really just pulled this one quote that sort of sums it all up. It says, zombie arguments infiltrate every aspect of life in matters big and small, weighty and irrelevant. Name a cultural or political fight we were having 20 years ago, and we're probably still having it. Access to safe and legal abortion, the benefits of affirmative action, whether LGBTQ people deserve equal rights, the true nature of Bruce Springsteen's politics. We're endlessly relitigating debates that felt decided decades ago. The main reason, of course, is that we elected Donald Trump again as re-litigator in chief. And I guess I lied. There's a second quote. It says, the aggrieved pseudo-nostalgia that fuels the Make America Great Again movement means no old argument can truly be settled, especially since the president seems perpetually stuck in the hottest debates of the 1980s and 90s, whether it's the suggestion that Cats is the pinnacle of theatrical achievement,
boy.
or that the dismantling of apartheid perhaps went too far, end quote, which I thought was a nice flourish.
Coupling.
I love a good coupling that makes for a good flourish in an article. And what this helped me realize is that Trump is the perfect culture warrior because he's genuinely hung up on culture wars, right? Like he doesn't even have to fake it that much. He likes to do the culture war thing, where I think a lot of politicians do it for political expediency. And then secondly, he's the perfect politician for our current time in society dominated by the attention economy, because similarly, he genuinely craves endless attention. I think we think of Donald Trump as having taken over our politics to a greater degree than we realize the nature of how, I mean, for decades before Donald Trump, culture wars were already a very potent weapon in politics. And then the addition of the supercharged attention economy in the smartphone and social media era
Right.
very much helped create him. You know, it's a full yin and yang situation where like he could have been the way he is, but if the ground wasn't fertile for his type of politics, it wouldn't have grown. So he had nothing to do with creating the attention economy. He just happened to be perfectly suited for it. And that is largely how we ended up with him.
I've unfortunately listened to Donald Trump clips a little more than usual. And like when you don't read about what he says, but when you actually just listen to him, it's the exact point that you were making with, the culture wars and things like that, especially for people who aren't super deep in politics like we are. Like what he's saying, it could flare all kinds of feelings for you, I'm sure. But the whole argument against Harvard, like when he wails on it, if you take away the like threat of authoritarianism and the fear that comes when you hear him speak like that, it just sounds like gossip. It just sounds like he's kind of like the Mean Girls table that's talking
Yes.
shit about someone trying to,
Absolutely.
Yes.
like it feels so school age, so high school, and he's really good at that. And that's about his bit. I don't hear him often veer from that course, and I think that's his lane, and he knows it. He's good at it, and he's going to keep on doing it.
You can clip this out, and it should be the title of the show. I think Donald Trump is the perfect president for America in 2025. I think he embodies so much of what's going on in the country in so many different ways. Obviously, there are people who view that as a good thing. I think they're the minority in the country for sure, even though it's being promoted to us that they are the majority. I think they are a small, very vocal minority. I think most people see Donald Trump and either kind of shrug and like, I can't believe he's president, or, hate him. And I definitely lean towards the latter. But he just got his finger on the pulse of what America is. And America is a country that has been sold bullshit, has believed a myth, and has watched a myth crumble in front of us, and is trying its hardest to re-establish that myth as true. And Donald Trump, that's his whole life. He's created a myth. It's fallen apart over and over again because he's a very unsuccessful businessman, but he's a very successful bullshit artist. That's America. It's a very unsuccessful country, but it's really good at selling bullshit.
Marketing.
Yeah, I mean, it's worked. We got a lot of money. It depends how you're measuring success, but I
For
mean,
whom?
I agree. I agree. I'm just saying on the surface. I think that Trump and the internet coming together. I've been trying to think, as we were reading these things, I'm like, could Donald Trump be as successful as he is without the internet as we know it? Was that even possible? And I guess it's possible, but I think that the internet has made us, what is the right word? Regress? Regress is kind of where I was going. Like, I think the internet has made us regress. It's re-litigation of old, stupid cultural arguments is one thing, but like, if that is what our quote unquote marketplace of ideas is about, then yes, we have regressed to like a more childlike state. And that allows someone like Trump, who is a man child and only wants to talk about ridiculous stuff and mostly only if it affects him personally, that is a perfect fuel to the fire already burning on the internet that is like kind of taking us back to this unintellectual, uncurious place. Like it really just in my adult life has transformed. Like the cultural vibes have shifted so hard. It's not like we didn't have fun on the internet 20 years ago. Like there was a lot of really creative, dumb, funny stuff on the internet and we all enjoyed it. But there was also an attitude of we're still having good conversations about things that matter, things that are important. And like, I don't feel that way anymore. Everything I see now is just a dumpster fire. There aren't good debates happening. They are all like absurd. So yeah, I mean, in that way, he is the perfect reflection of us. That's definitely how I feel about Trump.
It's like enshittification of the internet or something.
Right, right.
But to that point, like you saying that and making the connection between like culture wars, the internet, it makes me think that like the only way a 15, 18, 22-year-old boy would find anything this bumbling grandpa up there interesting
Mhm.
is because you can clip it, because you're digesting it through other means. Like
Yep.
if they had to listen to his hour-long speech anytime they wanted to get information about Trump,
Right.
there's no freaking way. And he wouldn't
Mhm.
be popular because you'd realize, oh, he is literally just rambling
Mhm.
about all these weird stories that like don't have any meaning to me and yet is somehow being connected. Like I think the jig would be up at that point. But because you can digest it and it's been, sent through so many different, like you get analysts who are now just showing you clips and telling you what he's actually saying. Like there's so many layers between you and him that it could be attractive.
So to wrap up, we're squeezing in one final article because David Sirota, writing for Jacobin, says in lovely prose what we have been pointing toward this whole time. So he wrote the article, Democrats Can Avoid Trump's Culture War Traps, and echoes a lot of what we've been saying. So remembering the previous point about Democrats not being able to tap into either side of populist arguments and how there's one available to them if they would only take hold of it. And, we're not diving deeply into the debate over abundance, the new polarizing buzzword dividing the left right now. But it is a reminder of how closely that philosophy tacks to Republican style deregulation. And so Sirota writes, through abundance, they are attempting to sell their party's increasingly affluent and shrinking voter base on the plutocrat approved idea that rather than being a generational catastrophe, conservatives' deregulatory assault on the New Deal hasn't gone far enough. Of course, that's Trump's own economic ideology and message, a reminder that corporate Democrats still believe they can compete with Trump by merely offering a more polite, stable, and culturally refined version of the boorish president. And of course, the alternate that we could be tapping into is presented quite straightforwardly as the huge upswell of support, the huge crowds flocking to rallies headlined by Bernie Sanders and AOC, the growing antitrust movement infiltrating the party, the periodic labor uprisings. I mean, it's not just Bernie. It's not just look at people showing up at Bernie's rally. There are things happening. There are movements constantly bubbling that Democrats are basically ignoring and certainly not tapping into. And so we'll leave the link to this article in the notes because the whole thing is worth a read. But Soro concludes saying, quote, something better is possible, particularly now as the economy teeters, but the working class will not be swayed by a Democratic Party more interested in creating a 21st century version of Rockefeller republicanism than in fighting the culture war. It's a war that Trump has spent his life fighting, but that can still be won if a MAGA alternative channels the populist uprising in a different direction.
As long as we're doing nostalgia, this is just fighting with this nonstop things were better back when. Let's do the FDR nostalgia. Like we've talked about it on the show several times. That's what people are actually
Grab that
wanting.
birch rod.
That's what they that's maybe not that part. But the potential candidates for president in 2028 or 2075 or whenever a Democrat could possibly be elected again. That's why I'm on, team hopefully class trader JB Pritzker, because he's offering that kind of, hey, we could build better, that we've got, more for everybody. And meanwhile, we've got Gavin Newsom, who is just this, like you said, Rockefeller Republican. Let's meet these people in the middle, bringing up Charlie Kirk again. He's like, he's got some good ideas. Let's just talk to him. That's not a way forward. That's just a way to completely solidify this new neo-feudal movement that we've got right now. That's where that is headed. We could go a different direction because clearly the vast majority of Americans are not happy with the way things are. That's why we're here. That's how we got here. What's on offer is a massive push from the right in culture, in policy, and an extremely limited pushback to, I think it was mentioned in one of the articles, what James Carville said the Democrats should do is just, lay over and play dead. And that seems like what the vast majority of Democrats in power are doing. I watched Hakeem Jeffries on CNN spit some word salad about meeting the moment, and Dana Bash asked a follow-up question, not her strong suit, but she did ask a follow-up question to Hakeem Jeffries, said, what does that mean? Because he didn't say anything that meant anything.
Yeah.
And he went back to the trope machine and the cliche button and said a whole bunch of other stuff that meant nothing. But that's kind of what's on offer from the vast majority of the Democratic leadership.
Yes.
Meanwhile, there is this huge upswell of emotion and feeling that something needs to change, that there has to be a way to change it and make it better. And I think I think you talked about it on the last episode, Jay, is that, who knows what's going to happen in 2 to 3 years. Just because we feel this way now about the Democratic Party doesn't mean it won't be grabbed and taken in a more positive direction in 2 or 3 years. And I really do think, maybe it's not JB Pritzker, but maybe it's somebody else, but it's all right there. There is just this deep desire to change the path of this country. And it can be taken by people who would change it in a direction that we like.
Okay, so it sounds like we're pretty close to having solved it, whether it's JB Pritzker or someone else. The path toward the messaging that actually works is pretty clear. The culture wars can't be ignored because vulnerable populations can't be ignored, but it is more than possible to consistently reframe culture war arguments as distractions. While you're getting angry at trans people in the bathrooms they're using, you're getting robbed blind. Is that how we're going to take the country back? Seems workable enough to me.
Sounds like a winner.
Yep, I think populist messaging, time and time again.
Excellent. Well, I guess that was easy. I'm always happy to wrap things up nicely like that. If you have thoughts on this or anything else, you can leave us a message, text or voicemail at 202-999-3991. Send an email to j@bestofleft.com or find us on Signal at bestofleft.01. Thanks for listening, and remember that this is all really happening, so continue to be decent, act like what you say and do matters, and do what matters most. There are 2 populist messages. 1, left populism. They're robbing you blind. Number 2, right populism. They think they're better than you. Progressives should stick to number 1 and not fall into number 2.
They think they're smarter than you. That's what the right repeats, while fortunes are shifting beneath our feet. They're making you angry, distracted, and spun as wealth funnels upwards, only for some. Don't buy the circus, don't get caught in the show. While we're fighting each other, their fortunes grow. Culture wars blazing, but here's what's true. It's not about others, it's about robbing you. Let's fight for fair wages, for health care for all. Break up the big banks, let the barriers fall. Tax the rich fairly, make the system anew. It's time for the many, not just for the few. It's time to speak plainly, call out the greed. Let our words be a rally for those in great need. If we fight for the people and all they've been through, we'll win back the trust and build something new. Step up, politicians, let your message be clear. Champion the people that you claim to hold dear. Push for real changes that all can see. Lead with conviction and make history. Step out of the chaos, step into the light. Build something fair, now join in the fight. Step out of the chaos, step into the light. Build something fair, now join in the fight. Step out